A millionaire kicked his son out of the house for falling in love with a humble farmer. However, he was paralyzed by what his son did. Richard Carter stood at the top of his world. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxurious office, he looked down at the city he had conquered. Skyscrapers bore his name, businesses thrived under his investments, and his influence stretched far beyond real estate. To everyone around him, he was the epitome of success, a self-made man who had built an empire with nothing but ambition and an iron will. But Richard knew that power was fleeting. He had clawed his way to the top, and he was determined to stay there. That meant securing his legacy, ensuring that the Carter name remained synonymous with wealth and influence for generations. And for that, he had one plan. His son, Daniel Carter, would inherit everything and take the empire even further. At least, that was what he thought. "Your son is waiting for you in the conference room, Mr. Carter," his assistant Evelyn informed him. Richard nodded, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He had asked Daniel to meet him to discuss the Carter legacy, and he expected the conversation to go exactly as he had envisioned. His son would agree to take his place, embrace the responsibilities of being a Carter, and eventually marry the right woman, someone from a respected family, someone who could strengthen their position in high society. But the moment Richard stepped into the conference room and saw the expression on Daniel's face, he sensed something was off. His son wasn't the eager heir ready to discuss business. He was hesitant, almost distant. "Dad," Daniel started, standing up from his chair, his hands in his pockets. "We need to talk." Richard took his seat at the head of the long table, folding his hands in front of him. "That's why I called you here. It's time to discuss your future." Daniel hesitated for a second, before taking a deep breath. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. I'm not going to take over Carter Enterprises." A heavy silence fell between them. Richard's eyes darkened. "Excuse me. I don't want this life, Dad. I never have," Daniel continued, his voice steady but firm. "I've tried to fit into this world, to be the son you wanted. But the truth is, I don't belong here. I've made my decision." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his son with a calculating gaze. "And what decision would that be?" Daniel squared his shoulders, bracing himself. "I'm going to marry Emily Foster." The name hit Richard like a slap in the face. Emily Foster, the farm girl, the nobody. His jaw clenched as he exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. "That girl, the one from the countryside." "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "She's everything I want in life. I love her, Dad, and I don't care about the money, the company, or the high society parties. I just want to be with her." Richard let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You think love pays the bills. You think love builds empires." His voice turned cold. "You're my son, a Carter, and you were born to carry on this legacy, not throw it away for some insignificant farm girl." Daniel's expression hardened. "She's not insignificant to me." "Of course she's not, to you." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Because she's filling your head with nonsense, making you believe in some romantic fantasy. But let me tell you how the real world works. Son, people like Emily, they're leeches. They latch on to men like you because they know they could never have this kind of life otherwise." Daniel clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "Emily doesn't care about money. She never has. She's worked her whole life to take care of her mother and keep her father's land alive. She's the strongest person I know, and I respect her more than I respect anyone in this city." Richard slammed his palm against the table, his temper finally breaking. "Enough," his voice echoed through the room. "You are not going to throw your future away for this nonsense." Daniel stood his ground. "I already have." A tense silence stretched between them. Richard stared at his son, searching for hesitation, for doubt, but he found none. Daniel's decision was made. Slowly, Richard straightened in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Then let's make this clear, Daniel." His voice was low, cold. "Final, if you walk out of this office and choose that girl over your family, over everything I built for you, you're on your own. No money, no inheritance, no Carter name." Daniel didn't flinch. He had expected this reaction. "I don't need your money, Dad," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I don't need the Carter name to be happy." Richard's hands curled into fists. He had always believed that money and power were the only things that truly mattered. He had seen people beg for his approval, for his resources. He had watched men crumble after losing their wealth. And yet, here was his own son, walking away from everything without a second thought, without another word. Daniel turned and walked toward the door. "Don't come back," Richard said, his voice cold and unforgiving. Daniel paused for a moment, then looked over his shoulder. "I wasn't planning to." And with that, he was gone. Richard sat in silence, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding. He had expected Daniel to break under pressure, to reconsider, but instead, he had walked away without hesitation. But Richard was certain of one thing: his son would come back. It was just a matter of time. The wind rustled through the tall grass as Daniel Carter stepped onto the worn wooden porch of the small farmhouse. The scent of damp earth and wildflowers filled the air, a stark contrast to the polished marble floors and city lights he had left behind. He knocked twice on the door, his heartbeat steady, despite knowing the weight of what he had just done. Emily opened the door, her blue eyes widening the moment she saw him. She didn't need to ask. His expression told her everything. "You really did it," she whispered, stepping forward, her hands lightly brushing against his arms as if to make sure he was real. "I did," Daniel confirmed, his voice steady. "I chose you." Emily inhaled sharply, searching his gaze. "And your father." Daniel let out a breathless chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Disowned me. Cut me off completely." Emily's chest tightened. She had always known Richard Carter wouldn't accept her, but deep down, she had hoped that Daniel wouldn't have to lose everything to be with her. She reached up, cupping his face gently. "Daniel, are you sure about this? About us?" His hands found hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "More than anything," Emily exhaled, closing her eyes briefly before pulling him into a tight embrace. He had given up everything for her, and now, it was her turn to prove that he hadn't made a mistake. Inside the modest farmhouse, the scent of fresh bread and chamomile tea lingered in the air. The walls were lined with bookshelves, a few framed pictures, and simple, handmade furniture. It was nothing like the luxury Daniel had grown up in, but to him, it already felt more like home than any mansion ever had. As they sat together at the worn wooden table, Emily's mother, Margaret, watched Daniel carefully. Her health had been fragile for years, but her mind was sharp. She knew what this decision meant for him. "You don't regret it, do you?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Daniel shook his head. Not for a second. Margaret gave him a long, knowing look before nodding. "Then welcome home." The words settled something deep within him. The following weeks were filled with challenges. Daniel was no stranger to hard work, but farm life was an entirely different world. He learned to wake before sunrise, his muscles aching from days spent tending to crops, fixing fences and hauling supplies. He had once managed million-dollar contracts, but now he found himself covered in dirt, hands calloused from labor. But through it all, Emily was by his side. They worked together, laughed together, and at night, as they sat beneath the stars, he knew he had made the right choice. One evening, as they rested on the porch after a long day, Emily looked at him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. "So, Mr. Carter, do you miss your suits and expensive whiskey?" Daniel smirked, stretching his arms behind his head. "Not even a little, though. I won't lie. I do miss having a hot shower that doesn't require waiting for the water to heat up." Emily laughed, nudging him with her shoulder. "City boy." He grinned, leaning closer. "Farm girl." Their laughter faded as their eyes met, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of the countryside, Daniel felt something he never had in his father's world: peace. But peace was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as Daniel and Emily were finishing up in the fields, a sleek black car pulled up on the dirt road leading to the farm. The sight of it sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped forward as the door opened, revealing a man in a tailored suit. "Mr. Carter?" the man greeted, adjusting his cuffs. "Your father sent me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "If this is about money, I don't want it." The man smirked. "Oh, it's not about money. It's about reminding you who you are." Emily stepped beside Daniel, her fingers brushing his hand. "He doesn't need reminding." The man glanced at her with barely concealed disdain, before turning his attention back to Daniel. Your father believes this. Phase will pass, he thinks, in time. You'll come crawling back. Daniel clenched his fists. Then he doesn't know me at all. The man sighed, shaking his head. Very well. But before I go, let me offer you a piece of advice. Love is beautiful, Mr. Carter, but it doesn't pay the bills. He handed Daniel a business card. When reality hits, you know where to find us. Without another word, he got back in the car and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Emily turned to Daniel, her expression filled with worry. Are you okay? Daniel exhaled slowly, crumpling the card in his fist. Yeah, just tired of people thinking they know what's best for me. Emily placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. You don't have to prove anything to them, Daniel. We're going to make this work. And he believed her. They spent the rest of the evening working, pushing harder, determined to build a future on their own terms. But as Daniel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, his father's words haunted him. He believed in their love. He believed in their dreams. But deep down, he also knew the real fight was only just beginning. Richard Carter sat behind his grand mahogany desk, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. The dim light of his office cast long shadows across the room. Reflecting his dark mood, days had passed since Daniel walked away, and yet, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that his son would come to his senses. No one walked away from a life of power and wealth without regret. He had given him time, enough time to realize the mistake he had made. But now, Richard was done waiting. If Daniel refused to return willingly, he would force him to see reason. With a cold resolve, Richard picked up his phone. Get me Samuel Price, he ordered. Samuel Price had been the family's lawyer and fixer for years, a man who specialized in ensuring that Richard Carter always had the upper hand. Within the hour, Samuel was sitting across from him, his face impassive, as Richard laid out his plan. My son thinks he can turn his back on everything I've built, Richard said, his voice sharp. He thinks love is enough to sustain him, but he will learn, just like everyone else, that love is weakness. Samuel nodded, taking notes. And how exactly do you want to proceed? I want him to feel the weight of his decision. I want him to understand that without me, without my name, he is nothing. Start with the property taxes on that farm. I want them raised to a level they can't possibly afford. Make sure the bank tightens their policies on any potential loans, and find out if that land has any outstanding issues. If there's one loophole I can use to take it from them. I want it exploited. Samuel smirked, nodding. Consider it done. Richard took a slow sip of his whiskey, a cold smirk curling his lips. Let's see how long they last. Miles away, in the quiet countryside, Daniel and Emily were unaware of the storm brewing. They had spent the morning at the local farmers market, selling their fresh produce and securing new business deals. The response had been overwhelming. Emily's innovative cultivation methods were attracting attention, and a few investors had even expressed interest in expanding their operations. Things were finally looking up. As they drove back to the farm, Emily glanced at Daniel, a smile playing on her lips. You seem lighter today, Daniel chuckled, keeping one hand on the wheel. I think I'm just starting to feel like this is ours. Not my father's world, not his expectations, just us. Building something real. Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it. We're going to be okay. But when they arrived at the farm, an unfamiliar car was parked outside. A man in a suit leaned against the hood, flipping through a folder. Daniel's stomach tightened. Looks like we have company, he muttered. Stepping out of the truck, the man straightened, offering a slick smile. Mr. Carter, Miss Foster. My name is Jonathan Reeves, legal representative for Carter Enterprises. Daniel's jaw clenched at the mention of his father's company. What do you want? Jonathan sighed, feigning sympathy as he opened the folder. I regret to inform you that the property taxes on this farm have been reevaluated. Due to new zoning regulations, your tax rate has significantly increased. Emily frowned, stepping closer. By how much? Jonathan handed her a document. As her eyes scanned the numbers, her face paled. This is impossible, she stammered. This is triple what we paid last year. Daniel snatched the papers, his eyes narrowing. This is my father's doing. Jonathan's smirk was barely concealed. Carter Enterprises has no involvement in city regulations, Mr. Carter, but I do have another document here that may interest you. He pulled out another sheet. Holding it out, this is a formal buyout offer for the property. A very generous sum, I might add. Daniel didn't even glance at it. He tore the paper in half and threw it to the ground. Tell my father he can go to hell. Jonathan sighed, shaking his head. I would reconsider that, Mr. Carter. Increased taxes, strict loan regulations. Things are about to get very difficult for you, but if you sign, you walk away with more money than you'd ever need. Emily stepped forward, fury in her eyes. This land belonged to my father. It's not for sale. Jonathan's smirk widened. How sentimental. But sentiments don't pay debts, Miss Foster. He stepped back toward his car. I'll give you a week to think about it. After that, I'm afraid your options will be limited. As the car disappeared down the road, Emily turned to Daniel, her breath unsteady. What do we do? Daniel clenched his fists. We fight. That night, as they sat on the porch, the weight of the situation hung heavy between them. Emily stared at the fields her father had nurtured, the land that carried her childhood memories. This was always going to happen, wasn't it? She murmured. Your father was never going to just let you go. Daniel exhaled sharply. I underestimated how far he'd go, but we're not giving up. Emily turned to him, determination flickering in her eyes. Then we need a plan, because if your father thinks we're just going to roll over and let him take everything, he has another thing coming. Daniel watched her, admiration swelling in his chest. She wasn't just strong, she was relentless. And if his father wanted a war, then that was exactly what he was going to get. But deep down, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Richard Carter didn't play fair, and he never lost. The next morning, Daniel was already awake before the sun rose. Sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window of their bedroom, the fields stretched endlessly beyond the glass, bathed in the dim blue light of dawn. It was peaceful, but the weight on his chest was anything but. Emily stirred beside him, blinking sleepily before propping herself up on her elbows. You didn't sleep, she murmured, her voice still husky from rest. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Couldn't. Too much on my mind. She sat up fully now, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, pressing her forehead lightly against his back. We'll figure it out, we always do. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. He wanted to believe that, but the reality was clear. His father had declared war, and they were at a massive disadvantage. By the time they stepped outside, the morning sun had begun to rise, casting golden hues over the land. But as beautiful as it was, today was not a day for admiration. They had work to do. The first stop was the town's agricultural office. Daniel and Emily needed answers. How was it possible that their property taxes had tripled overnight? As they stepped into the small, bureaucratic building, they were met with Mrs. Callahan, a stern-looking woman in her 60s who had overseen local property records for years. The moment they explained their situation, she let out a knowing sigh. I was afraid this would happen, she muttered, rubbing her temples. Daniel frowned. So you know what's going on? She nodded. It's Carter Enterprises. They have a way of influencing things. The zoning board was pressured into reclassifying your land under new regulations. It raised your tax bracket overnight. Emily clenched her fists. But that's not fair. This land has been in my family for generations. Mrs. Callahan gave them a sympathetic look. Fair? No. Legal, unfortunately. Yes. Daniel exhaled sharply. What about a loan? Maybe we could secure something to help with the payments. Mrs. Callahan hesitated. You can try, but I've already heard whispers that the banks are tightening lending policies, especially for properties flagged under Carter Enterprises' influence. Emily let out a bitter laugh. Of course they are. Daniel shook his head, frustration bubbling in his chest. He had expected his father to retaliate, but this was beyond anything he'd prepared for. As they left the office, Emily grabbed his arm. We'll figure something out, Daniel. We're not giving up. He looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes, and nodded. No, we're not. The next few days were filled with exhausting attempts to secure funding. Every bank they approached shut them down before they could even finish their pitch. Investors who had previously shown interest in their farm now suddenly backed out, offering vague excuses. The walls were closing in on them, and fast. One evening, as Daniel finished securing the last wooden post on the fence, he noticed Jack Dawson, one of their neighboring farmers, pulling up in his old pickup truck. Jack was a grizzled man in his 50s, someone who had lived through hard times and knew the struggles of farm life. He climbed out of his truck, tipping his hat toward Daniel. "Heard about your trouble," he said. Leaning against the fence, Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, my father's making sure we feel the heat," Jack sighed, shaking his head. "Typical Carter move. Your old man's got his hands in everything, but that doesn't mean you don't have options." Daniel crossed his arms. "I'm listening." Jack scratched his chin. "I know someone, Miguel Rivera, runs an independent investment firm. He doesn't play into Carter Enterprises' games. Might be willing to help if you can convince him." Emily, who had just stepped outside, caught the last part of the conversation. "Where can we find him?" Jack handed them a slip of paper with an address. "He's in town for a few days. If you want a fighting chance, you'll need to move fast." Later that night, Daniel and Emily drove into the city. The contrast between their simple farm life and the sleek, modern skyline of the financial district was stark. They pulled up to a high-rise, where Miguel Rivera's firm was headquartered. The receptionist eyed them skeptically as they approached. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Daniel admitted. "But we need to speak with Mr. Rivera. It's urgent." The receptionist pursed her lips. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Rivera doesn't take unscheduled meetings." Emily stepped forward, her determination unwavering. "Tell him we're the ones trying to save our farm from Richard Carter's grip." The woman hesitated for a moment, before picking up the phone. After a tense conversation, she hung up and nodded toward the elevator. "You have 10 minutes." They were led to a spacious office, where Miguel Rivera, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, sat behind a sleek glass desk. His dark eyes studied them as they entered. "You have my attention," he said, motioning for them to sit. "Now tell me why I should risk crossing Richard Carter for you." Daniel took a deep breath. "Because we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who's been bullied by men like him. We have a solid business model, a growing demand, and the determination to make this work. We just need a chance." Miguel leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "Carter Enterprises has power. More power than most are willing to challenge." Emily met his gaze. "Then maybe it's time someone did." A slow smile spread across Miguel's face. "I like your spirit, but spirit doesn't pay debts. Show me your numbers. Prove to me that investing in you is worth the risk." Daniel nodded. "Give us 24 hours. We'll bring you everything you need." Miguel considered them for a moment before nodding. 24 hours, that's all you get?" As they left the building, Emily squeezed Daniel's hand. "This is it. This is our chance." Daniel exhaled. "Then let's make it count." They had one shot to prove they were worth betting on. Failure was not an option. Richard Carter sat in the private lounge of one of the city's most exclusive clubs, sipping his whiskey while listening to the murmurs of business magnates around him. These were the men who had once admired him, feared him, aspired to be him. But lately, Richard had noticed a change, a shift in the way they spoke to him, the way their eyes flickered with something he wasn't accustomed to. Doubt. His patience was wearing thin. Samuel Price had assured him that the farm situation would be resolved soon, that Daniel and Emily would cave under financial pressure. And yet, they were still standing. That alone was enough to irritate him. But there was something worse gnawing at his mind. Whispers in the financial sector, unsettling rumors that some of his key investors were reconsidering their partnerships. He set his glass down, signaling to one of the servers, "Find Samuel? Tell him to meet me in my office now." By the time Richard arrived at Carter Enterprises headquarters, his mood had soured. The towering building, once a symbol of his dominance, suddenly felt smaller, its foundation cracking beneath his feet. Samuel was already waiting in the office, a thick folder in hand, his usual smirk replaced by something more cautious. "We need to talk," Samuel started, but Richard cut him off. "No, you need to tell me why my son is still standing," Richard snapped, his patience razor thin. Samuel exhaled. "Because he's more resourceful than you gave him credit for." He tossed a report onto Richard's desk. "They're meeting with Miguel Rivera." Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. Miguel Rivera, the one investor in the city who wasn't afraid to play against him. Samuel leaned back in his chair. If Rivera decides to back them, they'll have more than enough funding to withstand the pressure we've been applying, and not just that. If Rivera openly supports them, others might start questioning your tactics. Richard's jaw clenched. Then I'll make Rivera an offer he can't refuse. Samuel shook his head. You don't get it. Rivera isn't like your usual business partners. He doesn't fold under intimidation. And if you go after him, you risk making this personal. Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. It is personal. Samuel hesitated before speaking again. That's not all. There's something else you need to know. Some of your biggest investors, they're starting to worry about your recent business decisions. Richard narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Samuel sighed, pulling out another document. Your last few ventures. They've been high-risk investments. And now that word is spreading about the situation with Daniel. People are questioning if you're still the same Richard Carter they trusted. Richard slammed his fist on the desk. They're questioning me. Samuel didn't flinch. Your empire was built on certainty, Richard, but right now, investors don't see certainty. They see a man who is making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. Richard clenched his teeth. His entire body tense. I have controlled this city's real estate market for decades. Do you really think some farm deal is enough to make them doubt me? Samuel met his gaze. It's not the farm, Richard. It's the fact that you're obsessed with it, with destroying your son. He leaned forward. You taught people that business is about logic, not emotion, but now they're watching you break your own rule. Richard was silent for a long moment. His empire wasn't just money, it was perception. And if investors perceived him as unstable, as someone acting out of spite rather than calculated dominance, then cracks would start to form. Cracks that could destroy everything he had built. He exhaled, his fury simmering just beneath the surface. Then I need to remind them who I am. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel and Emily were in Miguel Rivera's office, finalizing their proposal. They had spent the last 24 hours working tirelessly, perfecting every detail, ensuring that there was no room for doubt. Miguel flipped through the documents, nodding slowly. You've done your homework, he admitted. Emily, seated beside Daniel, leaned forward. We know this farm has potential. With the right backing, it can become one of the most profitable agricultural businesses in the region. Miguel studied them for a long moment, before finally setting the folder down. You have passion, that's good. But let's be clear. Passion doesn't keep businesses afloat. Numbers do. And your numbers. He tapped the folder. They check out. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Does that mean... Miguel leaned back in his chair. I'll fund you. Emily exhaled sharply, relief washing over her. Daniel reached for her hand beneath the table, squeezing it. But, Miguel continued, his expression serious. Understand what this means. Once I'm in. Carter Enterprises won't scare me off, but you need to be prepared for escalation. Richard isn't going to take this lying down. Daniel nodded. We're ready, Miguel smirked. Then let's make history. The contract was signed, the deal was sealed, and for the first time since this war had begun, Daniel and Emily had leverage, but back at Carter Enterprises, Richard had already begun planning his next move. Late that evening, he stood at his office window. Overlooking the city, his reflection in the glass was that of a man who had ruled for years, who had never lost a battle, and he wasn't about to start now. His phone buzzed. He answered without hesitation. Sir. Samuel's voice came through. Rivera just finalized his deal with them. Richard's grip tightened around the phone. Then it's time to change the rules of the game. The storm was far from over. It was just beginning. The morning sun painted the fields in golden hues as Daniel stepped out onto the porch, inhaling the crisp country air. For the first time in weeks, a sense of relief settled over him. The deal with Miguel Rivera had changed everything. Emily emerged from the house moments later, stretching her arms above her head before smiling at him. You look different, she noted. Daniel chuckled, running a hand through his hair. I finally feel like we have a fighting chance. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. Because we do. With Miguel's investment, they could expand operations, hire additional workers, and most importantly, secure their land against any further attacks from Richard. They spent the next few days meeting with suppliers, acquiring new equipment, and strategizing ways to improve production. Their first major move was upgrading the irrigation system, an investment that would allow them to double their yield within the next season. Emily worked closely with agronomists to enhance soil fertility, while Daniel used his business expertise to negotiate better distribution deals with buyers across the region. Momentum was building. One afternoon, as they finalized a contract with a major organic food supplier, Emily glanced at Daniel with a spark of excitement in her eyes. "Do you realize what this means?" He smirked. "That we're officially a force to be reckoned with." She laughed. "That and we're no longer just surviving, we're thriving." The deal secured long-term buyers, guaranteeing financial stability for years to come. The farm, once struggling to make ends meet, was now one of the most promising agricultural ventures in the state. News of their success spread quickly. Articles surfaced about their innovative farming techniques, their resilience, and their meteoric rise despite the challenges they faced. Even local television stations requested interviews, eager to cover the story of how a disowned billionaire's son and a determined farm girl built an empire from the ground up. But with every victory, Richard Carter's fury grew. One evening, Daniel and Emily were reviewing the week's numbers when Jack Dawson stopped by. The older farmer leaned against the kitchen counter, shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You two have stirred up quite the storm," he said, sipping the coffee Emily had poured for him. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" Jack let out a slow breath. "Depends on who you ask. The farmers around here, they're rooting for you. But your father, word is, he's been pulling strings behind the scenes." Emily's expression darkened. "What now?" Jack set his cup down. "I heard he's pressuring distributors to blacklist your products. Some of them are scared to work with you." Daniel clenched his jaw. His father was relentless, refusing to let them grow without resistance. "We'll find new buyers if we have to." Jack nodded. "That's the spirit. But be careful. Richard Carter doesn't like to lose." After Jack left, Emily turned to Daniel. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." Daniel exhaled. "Yeah, but I didn't expect him to start targeting other businesses just to get to us." Emily crossed her arms. "Then let's hit him where it hurts. If he wants to control distributors, we'll cut out the middlemen. Let's sell directly to consumers." Daniel stared at her for a moment before breaking into a grin. "Emily Foster, you're a genius." They wasted no time. The next morning, they announced a direct-to-consumer initiative, setting up partnerships with local markets, restaurants, and online delivery services. Within weeks, their sales skyrocketed. Customers loved the idea of getting fresh produce directly from the farm. Demand surged, and soon, other small farmers in the area reached out, eager to join their network. They weren't just fighting against Richard Carter anymore. They were changing the industry, the media. Attention only intensified. Business analysts started comparing their model to larger agricultural corporations, noting that Daniel and Emily had created something revolutionary. Investors outside of Rivera's circle began showing interest, eager to get a piece of the growing empire. One afternoon, as Daniel reviewed their financial reports, Miguel Rivera called. "Congratulations, Carter," Miguel said, his tone laced with amusement. "You're making quite the name for yourself." Daniel smirked. "Glad to know my father's not the only one paying attention." Miguel chuckled. "Oh, he's paying attention, all right. And he's losing. His influence isn't as strong as it used to be, and people are starting to see that." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Then we keep pushing forward." Miguel's voice turned serious. "That's why I'm calling. I have a proposition for you." Daniel sat up. "I'm listening. I want to take this nationwide. Your model isn't just working. It's disrupting the market. With the right investment, we could expand to multiple regions, turn this into something that outlives both of us." Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily, who had been listening from across the room. Her eyes were filled with the same determination that had fueled them since the beginning. "We're in," Daniel said. As he hung up the phone, he turned to Emily. "This is it. The moment we prove to everyone that we're not just some underdog success story." Emily smiled. "No, we're building a legacy." Meanwhile, in his office, Richard Carter sat in silence, staring at the reports in front of him. He had underestimated them. He had believed that money and power were enough to crush his son's rebellion. But now, Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was winning. And for the first time in his entire career, Richard Carter felt something he never had before. Fear. Richard Carter sat at the head of the long, polished conference table in the boardroom of Carter Enterprises, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface. The air in the room was thick with unease, the kind that made men shift uncomfortably in their seats and glance at one another for reassurance. These were the same men who, for years, had stood by his side, feeding off his power, his influence. Now, their loyalty wavered. Their confidence in him was crumbling. He could feel it. The change in the air. His empire had stood strong for decades, unshaken by competition, economic downturns, or the shifting tides of the market. But now, the cracks were visible. His once unwavering control was slipping through his fingers, and the whispers that had lingered in shadows were now being spoken aloud in rooms where he was no longer invited. The doors to the conference room swung open, and Samuel Price, his most trusted advisor, stepped inside. Samuel had served Richard for years, a man who understood the game better than most. But tonight, there was something in his eyes, a hesitance that Richard didn't like. Samuel placed a thick folder on the table and cleared his throat. "Richard, we need to talk about the numbers," Richard exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Then talk." Samuel glanced at the executives seated around the table before flipping open the folder. Charts, graphs, and financial reports lined the pages, but Richard didn't need to read them to know what they contained. He already knew things were bad. He just didn't care to acknowledge it. Samuel took a breath. "Our stock has dropped 14% in the last quarter. Investor confidence is at an all-time low. Some of our biggest partners are rethinking their stakes in Carter Enterprises." Richard's jaw clenched. "They're panicking over nothing." Samuel shook his head. "They're panicking because the market sees a pattern, and that pattern is Carter Enterprises making risky, emotional decisions. They're worried, Richard, and when investors worry, they pull out." The silence in the room was deafening. Martin Hayes, one of the company's longest-serving executives, finally spoke up. "Sir, with all due respect, the board has raised concerns." Richard's gaze snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "The board?" His voice was dangerously low. Martin hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, they're beginning to question your leadership." A flicker of something dark passed through Richard's eyes. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Carter Enterprises exists because of me. This board, this company, the power you all enjoy, it's because I built it." Martin swallowed hard. "That may be true, sir, but even empires fall when they're mismanaged." Richard's grip tightened around the arms of his chair. Mismanaged. Was that what they were calling it now? His gaze flickered toward Samuel, the only man in the room whose opinion mattered. Samuel met his stare with something Richard had never seen before: pity. Richard let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "So that's how it is then. A few setbacks. And suddenly I'm the problem." Samuel exhaled. "It's not just a few setbacks. Richard, you've spent months chasing a personal vendetta against your son while the company suffered. Investors see that. The market sees that." Richard's face darkened. "I made this company what it is, and now you're dragging it down with you." A long silence followed. The weight of Samuel's words settled over the room like a suffocating fog. Richard finally stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "This meeting is over," he announced. His voice was sharp, final. "Anyone who doubts my leadership is free to leave." No one moved, but the damage was done. Hours later, Richard sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the skyline beyond the massive windows. The city stretched out before him, blinking with a million lights. Lights that, once, had felt like his. He had controlled this world, shaped its foundations, dictated the course of its power. Now, that power was slipping. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. A moment later, it buzzed again. Richard glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening when he saw the name, Daniel. He let the phone ring, debating whether to answer. A part of him wanted to let it go to voicemail, to pretend he didn't care. But another part, one he refused to name, was curious. Finally, he picked up. "I heard about the board meeting." Daniel's voice came through, even and composed. "It's all over the news," Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You called to gloat." "No," Daniel said simply. "I called to ask if this is really how you want it to end." Richard let out a dry laugh. "And what exactly do you think I should do? Apologize, beg for mercy. Daniel was silent for a moment before speaking. I think you should start asking yourself what's left when the power and money are gone. Richard's fingers curled around the edge of his desk. I don't need your sympathy, Daniel. I never said you did. The silence stretched between them. Richard had always been the one with the upper hand, always the one to dictate the terms of the conversation. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt like the weaker one. And for the first time, he saw it in Daniel's voice. Not just defiance, not just anger, pity, a feeling Richard Carter had never known. His fingers hovered over the phone, wanting to say something, anything, to regain control of the conversation. But before he could, Daniel spoke again. I hope you figure it out before there's nothing left, he said. Then, without another word, he hung up. Richard stared at the phone for a long time, his grip loosening. He had lost many battles in his life. He had lost business deals, allies, fortunes. But tonight, for the first time, he felt like he had lost something greater, something he could never get back. Richard Carter sat in his darkened penthouse, the skyline of the city sprawling before him like a kingdom he no longer ruled. The whiskey glass in his hand was untouched, the ice slowly melting, diluting the amber liquid as if time itself was eroding everything he had built. The weight of the past months had settled into his bones, pressing against him like an unbearable force. His world had always been structured, controlled, predictable, but now it was crumbling. His mind replayed Daniel's words from their last conversation. What's left when the power and money are gone? It was a question he had never needed to ask himself before, because he had never believed they could be taken from him. His empire had been built on an unshakable foundation of dominance. Fear, influence, money, these were the currencies that had bought him everything. Loyalty, status, respect. But now, as the cracks in his legacy widened, he saw the truth staring back at him. None of those things had ever been permanent. The next morning, he arrived at Carter Enterprises earlier than usual. The office, once a fortress of his absolute control, now felt foreign. The whispers in the hallways, the sideways glances, the sudden silence when he entered a room. These were all signs of a kingdom preparing for the fall of its king. Samuel Price was already waiting in his office, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. He had been the last one still standing, the only man who hadn't turned his back on Richard. But even now, his expression was unreadable, his movements careful. Richard didn't sit. He stood by the window, looking out over the city. How bad is it? Samuel exhaled, placing a single sheet of paper on the desk. The board has scheduled a vote of no confidence. Richard finally turned, his gaze sharp. When? Samuel hesitated. End of the week. A slow, bitter smirk tugged at Richard's lips. So they're done waiting. Samuel nodded. They're nervous. Investors are backing out. The company is unstable, they think. A leadership change is the only way to salvage what's left. Richard clenched his jaw. The only way, as if he were nothing more than a liability now. As if the years he had poured into this empire, the sacrifices, the relentless pursuit of power, meant nothing. He stepped closer to the desk, his hands pressing flat against the polished wood. And you, do you think they're right? Samuel held his gaze for a long moment. Then, in a tone softer than Richard had ever heard from him, he said, I think this is the first time you don't know how to win. The words cut deeper than they should have. Richard straightened, adjusting his cufflinks. A practiced motion, something familiar, something within his control. He wouldn't let them take this from him without a fight. But the next few days only made it clear. The fight was already lost. One by one, the people who had once feared him, respected him, followed him, turned their backs, calls were ignored, meetings were postponed, investors distanced themselves, eager to align with whoever came next. And then came the final blow. That evening, as he sat in his office, the screen of his laptop lit up with headlines that sent a cold fury through his veins. The rise of Daniel Carter, a new era in business innovation. Carter Enterprises faces leadership crisis as former heir's farm empire surges. Daniel Carter, the son who built his own fortune. Richard scrolled through the articles, his teeth grinding. They were already shifting their loyalties. The same media that had once glorified him was now writing him off as a relic of the past, an empire crumbling under its own weight, while Daniel's name rose like a phoenix from the ashes. That was when he saw the interview. Daniel, seated in front of a polished backdrop, speaking calmly to the reporter. "I never set out to compete with my father," Daniel said. "I only wanted to build something for myself, something real." The reporter leaned in. "And now that you're in a position of power, is there anything you would say to him?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'd tell him that power isn't about control. It's about building something that lasts. And if he ever figures that out, maybe he won't have to lose everything before he understands it." Richard slammed the laptop shut, his pulse pounding. It was over. 2 days later, the boardroom was filled with tension as Richard Carter took his seat for the vote. The faces around him, once filled with admiration, fear, deference, were now calculating, cold, distant. Samuel sat to his left, silent. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, as you are aware, this board has convened to discuss the company's future, given the current instability, the lack of investor confidence, and the recent financial downturn. We are forced to consider whether continued leadership under your guidance is in the best interest of Carter Enterprises." Richard knew what was coming, but hearing it still felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The chairman folded his hands. "Effective immediately, we will hold a vote of no confidence in your leadership." Richard's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. The votes came in, one by one, name after name, the people he had shaped, the men and women who had built their careers under his rule. When the final tally was counted, the decision was clear. They had voted him out. Richard sat motionless, his face unreadable. The chairman exhaled. "Mr. Carter, your time as CEO has officially come to an end." Silence. Richard stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. He glanced around the table, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The moment the doors closed behind him, he realized something chilling. For the first time in 40 years, he had nowhere to go. His name no longer held power. His fortune was crumbling. His legacy was tarnished. He stepped out onto the streets, the noise of the city feeling different. People passed him by without a second glance. The empire he had built, the weight of his name, no longer meant anything. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over a single contact. "Daniel?" His pride screamed at him to put the phone away, to fix this on his own, but his pride had already cost him everything. He hesitated only a second longer before hitting call. The line rang once, twice. Then, Daniel picked up. Richard exhaled. "I need to see you." A pause. Then, Daniel's voice, calm but unreadable. "I figured this call was coming." Richard swallowed hard. The words felt like gravel in his throat. He wasn't used to asking for anything. Daniel's voice softened, but just barely. "We'll talk, but this time, on my terms." And for the first time in his life, Richard Carter had no choice but to accept. Richard Carter had always been a man of power, a man who dictated the rules rather than followed them. But as he stood outside the modest farm, hands clenched into fists at his sides, he realized how much the world had changed, or rather, how much he had lost. The gravel road beneath his feet felt foreign, the scent of tilled earth and fresh hay clinging to the air, so different from the glass towers and polished wood of his former life. He had once looked at places like this with disdain, dismissing them as remnants of a world that had no place in his own. But now, this was the only place he had left to turn to. He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He hadn't slept, had barely eaten. Pride had sustained him for years, but now it left him hollow. The farmhouse door creaked open, and Daniel stepped onto the porch. His stance was firm, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Emily emerged, her eyes sharp, her posture guarded. They weren't expecting him to show up this quickly, but Richard knew that delaying this conversation wouldn't make it any easier. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "Didn't think you'd actually come." Richard forced himself to meet his son's gaze. "I didn't think I would either." Emily studied him carefully. The last time she had seen him, he had been a king in a throne room, barking orders. Convinced of his own invincibility, Now, standing before them in a suit that no longer carried the weight of authority, he looked human. Daniel let out a slow breath, stepping down from the porch. "Come inside." Richard hesitated only for a second before following. The farmhouse was simple, but there was something about it that unnerved him. It wasn't the size or the lack of grandeur. It was the warmth. It was a home, built on something real, something he had never truly understood. Emily set a mug of coffee in front of him before sitting across the table, her gaze unwavering. "Why are you here, Richard?" Straight to the point. He supposed he deserved that. He swallowed, running a hand over his jaw before answering. "I lost the company." The words felt foreign on his tongue, bitter. "The board voted me out." Daniel didn't react. "And?" Richard frowned. "And I have nothing left." Silence settled over the room. The weight of the admission hung between them. Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel before leaning forward. "Are you saying that because you mean it, or because you want something from us?" Richard exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "I don't know," he admitted. "I spent my whole life building something that I thought would last forever. But now that it's gone, He hesitated. The words felt like gravel in his throat. "I don't know what I am without it." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You still don't get it, do you?" Richard's jaw clenched. "Get what?" "That power was never about money or control. Real power is about what you build, the people you stand with, not the ones you step on." Daniel shook his head. "You thought you had everything, but in the end, you had nothing because no one stood by you." Richard wanted to argue, to fight back, to tell his son that he was wrong, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. Emily's voice was softer this time. "So, what do you really want, Richard?" He looked down at his hands. What did he want? He had spent so long chasing success, power, dominance, but now, sitting here, he realized he wanted something he had never known how to ask for. "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to know what I missed." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Then prove it." Richard frowned. "What?" Daniel leaned forward. "You think you want to learn? Then stay here. Work with us. Learn what it means to build something that doesn't rely on fear and intimidation." Richard scoffed. "You want me to work on a farm?" Emily smirked. "You don't have much of a choice, do you?" Richard's fingers twitched. His first instinct was to refuse, to walk away, to cling to whatever shreds of pride he still had left. But pride had already cost him everything, and deep down, he knew Daniel was right. Slowly, reluctantly, Richard nodded. "Fine." Emily exchanged a glance with Daniel before pushing herself up from the table. "Then you start tomorrow, sunrise." Richard lifted a brow. "Sunrise?" Daniel smirked. "Welcome to our world, Dad." The next morning, Richard experienced hell. By 5:30, Daniel was knocking on his door, shoving a pair of work boots toward him before leading him out to the fields. The air was cold, the ground still damp from the night before. Richard stood awkwardly as Daniel handed him a pair of gloves. "Start with the fencing. We need the post reinforced before the next storm." Richard stared at him. "You expect me to?" Daniel didn't wait for him to finish. He turned and walked off, leaving him no room for argument. The first hour was tolerable. The second was miserable. By noon, his arms ached, his back protested, and his expensive shirt was ruined beyond saving. Emily walked by, barely concealing her amusement. "How's the great Richard Carter handling manual labor?" Richard wiped sweat from his forehead, glaring. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" She laughed. "Nope. Watching this is way too satisfying." By sundown, Richard was exhausted. His body screamed in protest as he collapsed onto the porch steps. He had spent years ruling an empire, and yet, one day on this farm had broken him in ways he never expected. Daniel stepped onto the porch, tossing him a bottle of water. "Thought you'd quit by now." Richard took a slow sip before exhaling. "So did I." Daniel studied him. "Then maybe you're finally starting to get it." Richard didn't reply, because for the first time in his entire life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be Richard Carter, the empire builder. For the first time, he wanted to know what it felt like to just be a man. The second morning was worse. Richard Carter had spent his entire life in boardrooms, controlling billion-dollar deals with the stroke of a pen. Now, he stood in the middle of a field, dirt caked under his nails, his muscles aching from labor he hadn't done since he was a teenager. The sun had barely risen when Daniel tossed him a pair of gloves. "You're working with the cattle today." Richard stared at him. "You're joking." Daniel smirked. "Daniel." "Not even a little." Emily walked by, biting back a grin as she slung a basket over her shoulder. "Careful, Richard. The cows don't care about stock options." Richard glared at her, but she was already walking away. He sighed and turned back to Daniel. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" Daniel motioned toward the open field. "See that calf over there? It got separated from the herd. We need to guide it back before it gets itself into trouble." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "You mean I'm chasing cows now?" "Think of it as strategic realignment," Daniel said dryly. Richard muttered a curse under his breath but trudged forward. The calf, a small brown creature with wide, dark eyes, eyed him cautiously as he approached. "Come on now," Richard murmured, stepping closer. He reached out, but the calf bolted, kicking up dirt as it ran. Daniel burst out laughing from behind him. "You might want to move faster, Dad." Richard clenched his jaw and ran, or at least, tried to. His legs ached from the previous day's work, and the uneven terrain didn't help. The calf darted left, then right, and Richard quickly realized that despite all his years manipulating corporate giants, he was utterly powerless against a baby cow. By the time Daniel stepped in, guiding the calf back with practiced ease, Richard was breathless, his hands on his knees. "That," Daniel said, clapping him on the back, "was painful to watch." Richard glared at him. "You enjoy this, don't you?" Daniel shrugged. "I enjoy watching you struggle with something for the first time in your life." Richard wiped sweat from his brow, muttering under his breath. He knew Daniel had every reason to enjoy this moment. Years of resentment, of rejection, of being dismissed. And yet, despite how much Richard wanted to fight back, he knew Daniel was right. He had never struggled. Not like this. By midday, Emily sent him to help repair the irrigation system, which involved hauling heavy pipes and digging trenches. Richard's back screamed in protest. His hands, once accustomed to silk ties and luxury cars, were raw from gripping tools he had never needed before. Every muscle in his body burned. At some point, Jack Dawson, the older farmer from the neighboring property, wandered over, leaning against the fence as he watched Richard struggle with a wrench. "So, this is what rock bottom looks like for a billionaire," he mused. Richard shot him a glare. "You here to help or just to gloat?" Jack grinned. "A little of both." Despite himself, Richard let out a breath of laughter. It felt strange, laughing here in this place, covered in dirt, completely stripped of everything he once was. But there was something about it, something real. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Daniel and Emily, sipping a beer that had never tasted better in his life, he found himself staring out over the land. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, the fields stretching endlessly under its glow. "This place," Richard murmured. "It's different." Emily glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, struggling to find the words. "In the city, everything is about control. You push and pull until the world bends to your will. But here," he gestured toward the fields, "you don't control the land. You work with it, you respect it, or it ruins you." Daniel nodded. "Now you're getting it." Richard exhaled. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to understand. For years, he had believed that power meant bending the world to fit his image. But sitting here, watching the land he had once dismissed as worthless, he saw something else. Power in patience, in resilience, in building rather than taking, as the stars began to appear in the sky. Emily turned to him. "So, what happens now?" Richard knew what she was asking. Was he staying? Was he leaving? He stared at his hands, rough and dirt-stained, the calluses forming where there had never been any before. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think I'm not done here yet." Daniel smirked. "Then be ready, because tomorrow's even harder." Richard let out a tired laugh, shaking his head. Of course it is. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running the show. And maybe that was exactly what he needed. Richard Carter had never imagined a life where he would wake up before dawn, muscles aching from the previous day's labor, hands raw and calloused from work he once considered beneath him. Yet, here he was, standing on the porch of a modest farmhouse, watching the first streaks of sunlight break over the fields. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and hay, a stark contrast to the filtered air and polished floors of the high-rise offices he once commanded. His body protested every movement, but something deeper inside him was shifting, a change he couldn't quite name yet. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "You planning to stand there all morning?" Daniel's voice carried a hint of amusement as he sipped his coffee, leaning against the wooden railing. "Or do I need to remind you we've got work to do?" Richard exhaled, rolling his shoulders, feeling the strain in every fiber of his being. "I assume you're about to send me off to do another pointless, back-breaking task?" Daniel smirked. "That's one way to look at it. Another way, you're learning," Richard huffed, stepping down from the porch. Learning. The word felt foreign. He had spent decades teaching, mentoring men who feared him, controlling industries with a few well-placed investments. He was the one who dictated the rules, not the one who followed them. But here, none of that mattered. His name held no weight. His reputation meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was whether or not he could pull his own weight. Daniel led him out toward the eastern field, where the morning dew still clung to the tall grass. Emily was already there, tossing fresh feed into the troughs for the cattle, moving with ease and confidence. She glanced up when she saw them approaching, a small smirk tugging at her lips. "Surprised you made it out of bed," she teased. Richard gave her a flat look. "I'm here, aren't I?" "Barely," she quipped, brushing dirt from her hands. "Today, you're working the irrigation system." Richard frowned. "We fixed the irrigation system 2 days ago." Daniel smirked. "And now you're going to learn how to maintain it. Because on a farm, things don't stay fixed forever." Richard sighed. Of course. The morning was a test of patience more than endurance, while lifting heavy equipment had been its own torture. Learning the intricacies of the pipes, valves, and water pressure systems was something else entirely. Precision mattered. One wrong move could disrupt the entire system. He crouched by one of the pumps, watching as Jack Dawson, the neighboring farmer, demonstrated how to check the flow control. Jack had been enjoying Richard's struggles far more than he should. "Careful now," Jack warned, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Turn that too fast, and you'll have a fountain instead of a pipeline." Richard gave him a dry look, but followed the instructions. His fingers fumbled at first, unused to such meticulous work. But after a few attempts, he found a rhythm, adjusting the pressure with more control, more certainty. Jack nodded approvingly. "Not bad, Carter. Maybe there's hope for you yet." Richard didn't respond, but something settled in his chest. The morning dragged into afternoon, the sun climbing higher, sweat soaking through his shirt. He had never felt so physically drained in his life, but with each passing hour, something else happened. He stopped thinking about what he had lost. For the first time, his mind wasn't consumed by his ruined empire, his tarnished reputation, or the boardroom that had turned against him. For the first time, he was just working. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Richard found himself on the front porch again, nursing a bottle of water instead of his usual whiskey. His muscles screamed, his hands ached, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction settling into his bones. Daniel sat beside him, a beer in hand, watching the fields in comfortable silence. "You're getting better," Daniel said after a while. Richard scoffed. "If that's your way of telling me I'm less terrible at this than I was a week ago, I'll take it." Daniel smirked, but didn't argue. He took another sip of his drink, before his expression turned more thoughtful. "You ever think about what comes next?" Richard tensed. He knew this question was coming. Daniel turned to face him fully. "You've been here a while now. You've done the work. You've seen what we've built. But we both know this was never supposed to be permanent for you." Richard let out a slow breath. That was the plan, wasn't it? To figure things out, to regain his footing, and then, what, before? The answer would have been simple. He would have fought to reclaim Carter Enterprises, to restore his name, to remind the world that Richard Carter wasn't a man who could be discarded so easily. But now, I don't know, Richard admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the honesty. Richard let his gaze drift over the land. "For years, all I cared about was power, controlling everything, everyone. And now that I've lost it, I should be fighting to get it back. Daniel studied him, waiting. Richard shook his head. But for the first time, I don't think I want to. Daniel didn't react right away. Instead, he leaned back against the railing, contemplating his father's words. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Emily's voice carried from inside the house. "Dinner's ready, if you two are done brooding out there." Daniel smirked before standing. "Think you can make it to the table, old man?" Richard groaned as he pushed himself up. "Don't test me, boy." Inside, the table was already set, the scent of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables filling the air. It was a simple meal, nothing extravagant, nothing like the five-star dining he was used to. But as he sat down, surrounded by people who didn't fear him, who didn't expect anything from him other than to just be there, something settled in his chest. Emily placed a plate in front of him, raising an eyebrow. "You going to say grace, Richard?" Richard blinked. He hesitated, then let out a dry chuckle. "I think that's still a bit beyond me." Emily smirked. "We'll get there." Laughter echoed around the table. Warm and easy, and for the first time in a long, long time, Richard Carter didn't feel like he was falling. He felt like he was finally landing. The days blurred into one another, marked by the rhythm of labor and the quiet hum of the farm. Richard Carter no longer questioned the early mornings or the aching muscles. He simply got up, put on his boots, and worked. The man who had once commanded an empire from a leather chair now woke before the sun, his hands caked in dirt by midday, his shirt damp with sweat before noon. He no longer flinched at the sting of a splinter or cursed when a task took longer than expected. He just did the work. And slowly, things began to shift, not just within him, but in how the people around him looked at him. Jack Dawson no longer watched him with amused skepticism, but with something closer to respect. The other farmhands, who at first had whispered about the city man trying to play farmer, now worked alongside him, treating him as one of their own. And Daniel had stopped expecting him to leave. Richard didn't know when exactly the change had happened, but one evening, as they sat on the porch after another long day, Daniel casually handed him a beer, the way a man does for someone who belongs. There was no hesitation, no tension, just quiet acceptance. Emily, of course, was the hardest to win over. She still studied him as if waiting for the old Richard to snap back into place, to reveal this entire experience as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience before he returned to his world of power and money. But Richard didn't blame her. He had spent a lifetime being one kind of man. He couldn't expect people to believe in the change overnight. Hell, even he struggled to believe it sometimes. One morning, he found himself standing by the fence line, gazing over the land that had once seemed so small, so insignificant. But now he saw the details. The way the crops moved with the wind, the way the cattle shifted in quiet patterns, the way the land itself felt alive. He never understood before, but now he did. It wasn't just a business. It was something worth fighting for, and that thought scared him more than anything, because if he admitted that, if he truly accepted it, then it meant he had spent his entire life chasing the wrong kind of power. The realization sat heavy in his chest. That afternoon, as they worked near the barn, Emily handed him a set of receipts. "These are the supply orders for next season. We'll need to negotiate better rates with some of the vendors." Richard blinked, caught off guard. She was trusting him with something beyond physical labor. "You want me to handle this?" he asked carefully. Emily raised an eyebrow. "You ran $1 billion empire. I assume you know how to negotiate a bulk discount." Richard huffed a laugh but didn't argue. He took the papers, scanning the numbers. "These are too high. We can push back on at least 3 of these vendors." Emily smirked. "That's what I was thinking. I wanted to see if you'd catch it." He glanced up at her, searching her face for the usual guarded skepticism. But this time, there was something different. Trust. And that meant more than he could admit. As the days stretched into weeks, Richard found himself taking more responsibility. It wasn't planned, wasn't even intentional. It just happened. A problem with the feed supplier. He stepped in. A broken fence that needed immediate repair. He took care of it. A local buyer trying to undercut their pricing. He made the call. It was small at first. Little things, but little things add up. One evening, after the day's work was done, Richard sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a ledger of expenses. Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You look like you're actually enjoying that." Richard smirked, shaking his head. "I think I forgot how much I liked solving problems that actually matter." Emily studied him for a long moment before finally saying, "Then why do you still look like you're waiting for something?" He didn't answer right away, because he knew what she meant. Even after everything, a part of him still felt like he was in limbo, caught between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Emily sighed, pushing away from the counter. "You know, Daniel won't say it, but he's waiting for you to make a choice." Richard looked up. "What choice?" "To stop acting like this is temporary." The words hit him harder than he expected. She didn't wait for a response. She simply left him there, alone with his thoughts that night. Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had spent his life chasing something. Success, power, control. But what if? What if the thing worth having had been right in front of him this entire time? What if this land, this life, these people, was the only thing worth fighting for? The thought terrified him, because it meant that everything he had ever believed, everything he had ever built, had been for nothing. And accepting that would be the hardest battle yet. The morning air was crisp, thick with the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. Richard Carter stood near the fence line, watching as the first light of dawn crept over the rolling fields. His hands rested on his hips, fingers unconsciously gripping the fabric of his worn jeans. Jeans that had once felt foreign to him, but now felt like a second skin. He exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle over him. The sounds of the farm waking up surrounded him. The low calls of cattle in the distance. The distant hum of the windmill. The rhythmic clanking of metal as Daniel worked on a piece of equipment nearby. It was strange how familiar it all felt now. It had been weeks since he arrived. And yet, if he truly thought about it, he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when he had stopped feeling like an outsider. Maybe it was the first time he had worked through a full day without complaining. Maybe it was the moment he had repaired the irrigation system without supervision. Or maybe it was the simple fact that, for the first time in his entire life, he wasn't thinking about what came next. Daniel walked up beside him, hands in his pockets, watching the sunrise with the same quiet appreciation. He didn't speak for a long time, and Richard found that he didn't mind the silence. Eventually, Daniel took a sip of his coffee and said, "You're different." Richard let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "So I keep hearing." Daniel smirked. "Well, you used to be an insufferable bastard." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Used to be." Daniel shrugged. "Work in progress." They stood there for a few more moments before Daniel tilted his head toward the barn. "Come on, we've got a long day ahead." Richard followed, his boots kicking up dust as he walked. The morning unfolded the way it always did. With problems that needed solving, a section of fencing had collapsed overnight, which meant the cattle had started wandering too far out. One of the tractors had a fuel line issue that needed fixing before the afternoon deliveries, and, as always, there was more work than there were hours in the day. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Richard simply worked. He didn't argue, didn't hesitate, didn't look for shortcuts. When Daniel handed him a hammer, he took it without question. When Emily gave him a list of supplies they needed from town, he nodded and got in the truck. And when Jack Dawson stopped by in the afternoon, leaning against the fence with his usual smirk, Richard barely reacted when the old farmer said, "So, you finally gonna admit you're one of us now?" Richard wiped the sweat from his forehead and let out a breath. "I'm still figuring that out." Jack chuckled. "You've been figuring it out for weeks." Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the land, the fields that stretched for miles, the animals moving in easy patterns, the sun casting golden light over everything, like a painting come to life. He had spent his whole life chasing the next big deal, the next financial conquest. He had controlled entire markets, dictated trends in the real estate industry, commanded people with nothing but his name. And yet standing here, in the middle of a farm he once thought was beneath him, he realized something unsettling. None of it had ever felt like this. The exhaustion that came with honest work, the satisfaction of solving a problem with his own two hands, the quiet companionship of people who didn't fear him but respected him. This felt real. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about belonging. Jack gave him a knowing look before tipping his hat and heading back toward his truck. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard found himself at the kitchen table, flipping through the farm's financial ledgers. Emily walked in, pausing in the doorway when she saw him. "If you're about to tell me we're running things wrong, don't bother. I already know where we can improve." Richard smirked. "I wasn't going to say that." Emily crossed her arms. "Oh, then what?" He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I think we could expand," she frowned, stepping closer. "Expand how?" Richard flipped the page, tapping a section of numbers. "You're already running things efficiently, but the demand is higher than what we're producing. If we purchase the neighboring property, we could increase output without compromising quality." Emily narrowed her eyes. "And you just happened to be thinking about this?" Richard hesitated before answering. "I wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. And if I'm staying, I want to build something bigger." Emily studied him carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation, but she found none. Instead, she saw certainty. Daniel walked in, drying his hands with a towel. "What's going on?" Emily turned to him. "Your father thinks we should expand." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Your father?" Richard let out a breath, shaking his head with a smirk. "Guess that means I really am staying, huh?" Daniel didn't say anything right away. He just looked at him, really looked at him, before nodding. For years, Richard had expected respect to come from fear, from dominance, from power. But tonight, when his son nodded, it wasn't because he was forced to respect him. It was because, for the first time, Richard had earned it. The wind carried the scent of the harvest. As Richard stood at the edge of the field, watching the workers move methodically through the rows, the land stretched far beyond what he once believed it was capable of, thriving under Daniel and Emily's leadership. But now, he was no longer an outsider looking in. He was a part of it. That realization should have felt like an ending. Instead, it felt like a beginning. He had spent so much of his life clinging to the past, holding on to an empire that he built with power, intimidation, and relentless ambition. But power meant nothing if there was no one left to stand beside you when it was gone. The Carter name once held influence, but here, in this place, it was just another name. He wasn't Richard Carter, the mogul. He was just Richard, a man working the land, earning his place among people who valued effort more than wealth. He still carried ghosts of his past, but they felt lighter now, until the past came knocking. The truck pulled up slowly, its engine humming as it rolled to a stop near the barn. Richard didn't need to see the driver's face to know who it was. He recognized the vehicle, the way it parked with calculated precision, the way the door opened without hesitation. Samuel Price, Richard's former right-hand man, stepped out, adjusting his jacket as he scanned the farm with the same sharp gaze that had once dissected real estate deals worth millions. His expression was unreadable, but Richard could sense the weight of the moment before a single word was spoken. They hadn't seen each other since the board meeting that sealed his fate. Samuel took a slow breath before speaking. "Didn't think I'd find you here?" Richard crossed his arms. "Didn't think you'd come looking." Samuel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "I had to see it for myself." His gaze flickered over the land before settling back on Richard. "Never pictured you in a place like this." Richard smirked. "Neither did I." Silence stretched between them. Then Samuel sighed. "Richard, the company it's worse than I expected." Richard's jaw tightened. He had stopped thinking about Carter Enterprises, or at least tried to. It was no longer his battle. He had made peace with losing it, with walking away, but hearing it now from Samuel stirred something inside him. "How bad?" Richard finally asked. Samuel exhaled. "They tried to stabilize things after you left, but the damage was too deep. The board is in chaos. The investors don't trust anyone. Every attempt to salvage the company has only made it worse." He paused before adding, "The Carter name isn't what it used to be." Richard wasn't sure why, but that last sentence hit harder than the rest. For decades, his name was power. It had been feared, respected, envied. Now, it was just another name fading into obscurity. Samuel stepped closer. "There's talk of selling it off in pieces. If they do that, everything you built, it'll be gone." Richard inhaled deeply, weighing the words. He had spent his life fighting for control, believing that his legacy would last forever. But nothing lasted forever. Not power, not wealth, not even influence. And yet for the first time, he wasn't angry. He wasn't desperate to get it back. Instead, he felt something he never expected. Relief. He turned toward the house where Emily stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans as she watched them. Daniel was near the barn, giving instructions to one of the farmhands. This was his life now, and he didn't want to leave it. Richard looked back at Samuel. "So that's why you came? To convince me to fix it?" Samuel studied him. "If you wanted to, you could. We both know that." Richard ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "I spent my whole life building Carter Enterprises. Samuel, I sacrificed everything for it." He glanced toward the fields. "But for the first time, I don't want to fight for it anymore." Samuel's expression shifted, a flicker of something almost like understanding crossing his face. "You really changed," Samuel said after a long pause. Richard chuckled. "Believe it or not, I like it here." Samuel shook his head with a small, amused smirk. "I never thought I'd hear those words come out of your mouth." Richard sighed, then looked at his old friend. "The company's not mine anymore, Samuel. I lost it. And maybe that's the best thing that ever happened to me." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right, I had to try." Richard smirked. "You wouldn't be you if you didn't." Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Before I go, I think you should have this." Richard frowned, taking it. "What is it?" Samuel hesitated. "A letter from the board. Technically, it's an offer." Richard's fingers tightened around the envelope. "They want me to come back." Samuel shrugged. "They want stability. You're the only person who ever held them together." Richard didn't open it. Didn't need to. He already knew his answer. Samuel glanced at the farm again, his gaze lingering on Daniel and Emily before turning back to Richard. "This place, it suits you." Richard nodded. "Yeah, I think so too." Samuel extended a hand. Richard looked at it for a moment before shaking it firmly. "If you ever change your mind," Samuel said, "you know where to find me?" Richard smirked. "I don't think I will." Samuel gave him one last nod before getting into his truck. As the vehicle rumbled to life, Richard stood there, watching as his last true connection to his old life disappeared down the dusty road. He looked at the envelope in his hands. Then, without hesitation, he tore it in half. Daniel, who had been watching from the barn, walked over. "That was a big decision." Richard let the torn pieces fall to the ground. "No, it wasn't." Daniel studied him. "So that's it. You're really staying." Richard turned toward the house, where Emily had disappeared inside, probably finishing up dinner. The land stretched before him, golden in the evening light. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm staying." Daniel smirked. "Took you long enough to admit it." Richard chuckled, shaking his head as he clapped a hand on his son's shoulder. "You always were more patient than me." Daniel laughed. "That's not saying much." They walked back toward the house together. The past finally left behind. The future something worth looking forward to. And for the first time in his life, Richard Carter felt truly, completely free. The sun sat low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the land as Richard stood near the fence line, watching the cattle graze. The wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying the distant sounds of farmhands finishing up their work for the day. It was the kind of evening that, a few months ago, he wouldn't have even noticed. Too busy chasing power, too consumed by numbers and boardroom politics. But now, he stood still, taking it in. This was his life now, and he had chosen it. The decision to stay had been final. There was no second guessing, no wondering if he had made the right call. He had walked away from Carter Enterprises, from the name that once commanded respect and fear, from the empire he had spent decades building, and yet he had never felt more at peace. But peace, he was learning, never lasted long. Daniel approached from the barn, his face tight with concern. Richard immediately knew something was wrong. "We have a problem," Daniel said, wiping his hands on a rag. Richard frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The south pasture," Daniel said. "The storm last night did more damage than we thought. The fencing's down in multiple spots, and we've got cattle close to breaking through, if they get loose." Richard didn't need him to finish. If the cattle wandered too far, it would be a disaster, a loss of thousands of dollars. not to mention the sheer work of rounding them up again. "We'll fix it," Richard said without hesitation. Daniel gave him a measured look. "It's not going to be easy. It's already late. We don't have much daylight left." Richard rolled his shoulders. "Then we'd better move fast." Within minutes, the entire team was mobilized. Trucks rumbled toward the pasture, supplies loaded in the back. The farmhands moved with practiced efficiency, but the urgency was clear. This wasn't just another repair job. This was a race against time. When they reached the damaged section, Richard quickly assessed the situation. The fence was in worse condition than he expected. Large sections had collapsed, leaving gaping holes wide enough for the cattle to wander through. Some posts were snapped clean in half, others barely hanging on. Richard grabbed a coil of wire from the truck, his muscles protesting as he pulled it toward the broken fencing. Sweat gathered at the base of his neck, but he ignored it, already focused on the task ahead. They worked fast, but not fast enough. The cattle were restless, sensing the vulnerability in the fence. A few had already begun testing the gaps, sniffing at the openings, growing bolder by the minute. "We need more hands on that section," Daniel called out. Motioning toward a weaker part of the fence, Richard didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, grabbing a hammer and reinforcing the wooden posts, his grip tight, his heart hammering in his chest. His body was exhausted, but there was no time to stop. For so much of his life, he had fought to control people, to control power, to control outcomes. But here, there was no control, only the work. The problem in front of him, and the urgency to fix it before it was too late. A loud crack split the air. One of the cattle had pushed hard against the weakest section of the fence, snapping the last support beam. Before Richard could react, the animal surged forward, breaking through the opening. And once one went, the others would follow. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered, already sprinting toward the truck to grab the ropes. Richard didn't think, he just moved. Without hesitation, he ran toward the broken section, grabbing a length of wire and pulling it across the gap, blocking the escape route before the rest of the herd could charge through. His muscles burned, but he held tight, planting his feet as the cattle hesitated, thrown off by the sudden barrier. For a few agonizing seconds, it was a standoff then. Slowly, the cattle backed off. Richard let out a sharp breath, his grip loosening just as Daniel and the others rushed in to reinforce the fence. The next few minutes were a blur of hammering, tightening wire, and securing the perimeter before another breach could happen. By the time they were done, the last of the light had faded, leaving them working under the glow of the truck's headlights. The fence held, the cattle were secured. It was over. Richard sank down onto the grass, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his back. Every muscle in his body screamed, exhaustion weighing on him like a ton of bricks. Daniel flopped down beside him, letting out a heavy sigh. "Hell of a night." Richard let out a breathless chuckle. "You're telling me?" For a few moments, they sat there in silence, watching as the farmhands packed up the tools and supplies. The wind was cooler now, carrying the scent of soil and rain. Daniel wiped a hand over his face. "You handled yourself out there." Richard smirked. "You sound surprised." Daniel shook his head. "Not surprised. Just impressed." Richard didn't say anything right away. He had spent his life chasing admiration, demanding respect from men in suits who feared him. But sitting here, covered in dirt and sweat, earning his son's respect through effort, not power, that meant more than anything he had ever achieved before. Emily walked up, hands on her hips. "You two planning to sit there all night, or are you actually going to help clean up?" Richard groaned as he pushed himself to his feet, his legs protesting the movement. "Do I at least get a drink after all this?" Emily smirked. "If you don't pass out first," Richard chuckled, shaking his head as he followed them back toward the truck. The night had been brutal, but the fence held. The farm was safe, and for the first time, he felt like he had truly earned his place here. The morning after the storm, the air was still thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. Richard Carter awoke with a deep ache in his muscles, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. He groaned as he sat up, stretching his shoulders and feeling every bit of the previous night's work. For the first time in decades, he had earned this exhaustion, slipping on his boots. He stepped outside, breathing in the cool air as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The farm was quiet, save for the distant sounds of the cattle shifting and the faint hum of the wind. It was peaceful, honest. Daniel was already at the barn, checking the reinforced fencing. He looked up when he saw Richard approaching, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Surprised you can still walk?" Richard rolled his eyes. "I've survived worse," Daniel chuckled, leaning against the fence. "Yeah, well, I've never seen you work that hard before," Richard exhaled, his gaze sweeping across the land. "Guess I finally had something worth working for." Daniel didn't respond right away, but Richard could feel the weight of his words settling between them. He had spent his life chasing something: success, power, control, and yet, standing here, surrounded by real work, real people, real connections, he finally understood that none of it had ever mattered the way he thought it did. Emily approached, her arms crossed as she studied Richard. "You're still here," Richard smirked, "not getting rid of me that easily." She raised an eyebrow. "You said that like you actually belong here." Richard met her gaze, his smirk fading into something more serious. "Because I do." Emily blinked, clearly caught off guard. She had been waiting for him to run, waiting for him to change his mind, waiting for the old Richard Carter to reappear and remind everyone who he really was. But that man was gone, and for the first time, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The morning moved on, the routine feeling more natural than it ever had before. Richard worked alongside Daniel and the farmhands, fixing minor repairs, checking inventory, even negotiating a new supply order with a vendor. It was work, real work, and he didn't just tolerate it, he enjoyed it. By noon, as they sat around the kitchen table for lunch, Emily leaned back in her chair, studying him. "So, what now?" Richard wiped his hands on a napkin, setting it aside. "What do you mean?" Emily tilted her head. "You're staying. You've made that clear. But what does that actually mean? Are you just going to help out here and there? Or are you actually going to be a part of this?" Silence settled over the table. Daniel glanced at him, waiting. Richard looked down at his hands. Hands that had once signed contracts worth billions, that had once dictated the fate of companies. Industries, entire markets. Now, they were rough, calloused, lined with dirt and hard work. He wasn't that man anymore, and he didn't want to be. Lifting his gaze, he met Emily's eyes with certainty. "I want to be a part of it," he said simply. "Not just helping out, actually invested in it, the land, the business, all of it." Emily studied him, searching for any sign of hesitation. She found none. Daniel finally spoke. "That means putting down roots, Dad. Committing. Not just working the land, but owning it, protecting it, growing it." Richard nodded. "I know." Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Then let's make it official." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Daniel pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "I had a feeling this was coming, so I had the paperwork drawn up." Richard hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were property agreements, business partnership contracts, and land ownership documents. His name was already typed on the forms, alongside Daniel and Emily's. They had been waiting for him to be ready. Now he was. Richard swallowed, his throat tight. "You're serious about this?" Daniel nodded. "We wouldn't offer if we weren't." Richard exhaled, running a hand over his face before shaking his head with a smirk. "And here I thought I was the one who made all the deals." Emily smirked back. "Welcome to the new world, Carter." Without hesitation, Richard picked up the pen and signed his name. The moment the ink dried, something inside him settled, not just in his mind, but in his soul. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just building something for himself. He was building something that mattered. Later that evening, as he stood on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky, Daniel joined him. 2 beers in hand, he handed one to Richard before leaning against the railing. "So," Daniel said after a long silence, "you're really one of us now." Richard smirked. "Looks that way." Daniel took a sip of his beer, glancing at him. "You regret it." Richard thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "Not even for a second." Daniel nodded, a slow smile forming. "Good." And as the stars began to appear overhead, Richard Carter finally knew what it meant to be home.